Tonight we have the distinct honor of hosting Michael Duffy, an accomplished journalist and author who will discuss his new book, The President's Club, which he co-authored with Nancy Gibbs, who is deputy managing editor of Time magazine. Gibbs and Duffy have also co-authored a previous book, The Preacher and the Presidents, Billy Graham in the White House. So they've been studying presidents and presidential relationships for a very long time. This new book has been on the bestseller list of the New York Times since it came out and now holds the coveted 8th position. As you might guess, Mr. Duffy and Ms. Gibbs have been in great demand to talk about the new book. Some of you might have seen them on C-SPAN several weeks ago, and there was a replay Sunday night, a 2-hour special with Brian Lamb, which was wonderful, which I had the pleasure of seeing. And they've been on virtually every network show with extensive time devoted to covering this book. They were also featured in a recent cover story in Time magazine, which is not quite the slam dunk you might think, even though they both work for Time. There's a story there as well. We owe a great debt to Mary Lukens, a great friend of the Ford Library here in Ann Arbor, for allowing us to use her name and longtime friendship with Mr. Duffy to help encourage him to come to speak here at the library. Mary, thank you so much.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. As they say in politics, you gotta use your friends. And Mary came through for us. Michael Duffy has a most impressive resume. He is currently executive editor for Time magazine, directing the coverage of presidents, politics, and national affairs for both the magazine in the print form and also Time.com. He has also been a regular guest on the PBS program Washington Week in Review, one of my favorite programs, for the past 15 years. He joined Time in 1985 as a Pentagon correspondent, but in the years since has moved on to cover Congress, the White House, national politics, and national security issues. He has the distinction of having written more than 50 Time cover stories, which is pretty incredible. He also has a claim to fame as a 2-time recipient of the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Award, first in 1994 for distinguished coverage of the presidency, and again in 2005 for distinguished reporting on national defense. This award is very prestigious. It has been given annually for 24 years at a June event at the National Press Club in Washington, and it recognizes outstanding reportal excellence and the fostering of better public understanding of the presidency and national defense. While the stipend for the award is given by the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, selection of the winner is made by an independent panel of journalists and academics. And I've heard from various winners that indeed they view it as their version of the Academy Awards of journalism. There's a great deal I could tell you about this book, the extensive research and interviews Duffy and Gibbs conducted, the fascinating stories they revealed, the wonderful quality of the writing, and I mean that very, very strongly, and the high praise they have received from many very distinguished presidential historians. But I will let our distinguished guest tell you all about that. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Duffy to his first ever visit to the Ford Presidential Library.
Thank you, Elaine, for that ridiculous introduction. I do appreciate it, and thank you, Joe, for having us here today. And as for my longtime friendship with Mary Lukens, just by coming here tonight, I'm putting it very much in jeopardy. So we'll see whether it survives, but I hope it does. I also want to thank you for that welcome. As no doubt, at least most of you probably know, I am from Central Ohio, so that was really beyond the call of duty, I thought. And I'm sorry that my co-author isn't here because she's much smarter than I am, and she wrote half the book, and I'm sure that by the end of the evening you'll be able to tell which part I didn't write. But it's a great treat to be here. President Ford plays an amazing role in this book, from some of its earliest days to some of its latest, a tribute to the long innings he had, not just in our public life, but in the club. And I'll start by talking just a little bit about the club. When Nancy and I first thought this book up, we thought the club was our idea. We thought, let's write about the guys who did the job and how they got along during, before, and after. And we soon came to realize it wasn't just our idea. They talk about it like it's a club. It has its own rules. It has its own feast days. It has its own taboos. It has its own trinkets. It even has its own clubhouse. We all love to read presidential biographies. I love, Edmund Morris on Teddy Roosevelt, David McCulloch on Harry Truman, Robert Caro on Lyndon Johnson. These are some of the most pleasurable things I think we have as readers and as citizens to read, and we love those books too. But when Nancy and I set out to write about this group of men from essentially Truman on, we wanted to hold them up not as individuals but together. We thought there are other books for individuals. What would happen if we put them next to each other? What sparks would fly? What relationships would we see? And we knew from our own experience, whether in business or in journalism or just in our lives, that relationships matter. It's not the only thing that matters, but they matter a huge amount to all of us. And we thought, why hasn't anyone done this with the presidents? We thought this story is hiding in plain sight, and no one has taken it up. And we quickly came to realize that maybe there was a reason no one had tried this. So that was our goal, was to basically take the men who we look at as individuals and we love to study one-on-one and simply pair them up, and sometimes put them in threes. And we thought we would learn a couple of things. First, we thought we'd learn something about the men themselves. We thought we would learn something different about the presidency itself, though we didn't quite know what. And we thought we also might learn something about our politics, which are clearly broken and need work. And this is just, when we saw Bill Clinton last fall, we were asking him about the club. And this picture was never published until we put it on the cover of Time 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's a Brooks Craft picture taken at the moment when President Obama brought in President Bush and President Clinton to go to work on Haiti. And we thought it was a particularly revealing picture because you actually feel like you're listening in. He isn't touching them, but it kind of feels like he is. And we talked to Clinton last fall in his office in Harlem, and we said, what is it about this relationship? And there's more to tell, but he said, he had this wonderful quote, when your ambition is slaked, it becomes more important to see something good happen to your country than to just keep winning arguments. At some point, you're just glad when the sun comes up in the morning, you get up, and you want something good to happen. I don't think it's because we all become saintly. One of the animating ideas behind the club was something a senior official in government who worked for President Bush and President Clinton told us very early on in our reporting, which was, when you get this job, 3 things happen pretty quick. You walk into the office and your first thought is, oh God, I've been set up. And your second thought is, maybe the people who were here before knew what they were doing. And your third thought is, this is someone who briefed both those 2 men on the outside every day for 2 years each. Third thought is, who am I going to talk to about this? And in that spirit, we then decided to go forth and see what we could see. The club, as it turns out, has its roots in events in more than 60, almost 70 years ago. We start in 1946. This picture was taken within the first week of Harry Truman's presidency. He comes into office, obviously, not on his timetable, and he is confronted with many immediate problems, but one of the most important is how he was going to feed essentially 100 million starving Europeans after the war. There's no one in the US government that he can find who knows anything about how to feed that many people. And he decides that the only living expert in the world there is a guy who just turns out to have had the job about 13 years earlier, Herbert Hoover, who had overseen European feeding programs after World War II. Now, Herbert Hoover had not been in the White House in 13 years. I think most of you probably know that. I think Teddy Roosevelt had that lovely quote, he's saying, I'm not Jesus Christ, I'm not going to resurrect Herbert Hoover. But Truman didn't care. He needed to feed the world. So he went and he wrote Hoover a secret letter. He didn't tell the New Dealers who he was surrounded by that he was going to bring in the devil incarnate. He just did it. And Hoover didn't trust the letter. He thought, this is a trick, it's a trap. And they have a long 4-week dance about whether they're actually going to get together. And they eventually do. And Truman says, I need you to hit the road. And over the next 6 or 8 months, Hoover goes. He gets a plane, and he gets a staff, and he gets a budget, and he goes to something like 55 countries. And over the course of the next 6 months, he gets the food, mostly in South America and Northern Hemisphere, from where it is to where it needs to be. And he does it because he's done it before. And he and Truman become regular buddies over the phone. They actually do broadcasts together. This drove the New Dealers a little nuts. And they would eventually come to blows, But they forged a partnership against odds, some of it done entirely in secret, that had never really been seen before. Presidents had survived office before that, but they hadn't quite lived as long. Hoover would set a record that stands till this day, probably going to be broken later this year. So that by 1953, on the dais of Ike swearing in, and by now Hoover and Truman had done a couple things. They did the Hoover Commission together. They worked together on a number of different reforms in reorganizing the government. Hoover goes up to Truman on the dais while Ike is across the stage. And they don't much like Ike, either of them, yet. And he says, I think we ought to organize a former president's club. Fine, says Truman. You be the president of the club, and I'll be the secretary. Over the next 20 years, 30 years, different presidents add different membership benefits. Yes, there's a benefit to being in the club, and I guess Ike adds, a pension and mailing rights. I believe it's Johnson who adds Secret Service protection. And Johnson is so concerned about the presidents who've come before, by then this is Ike and Truman, that he offers them, movies from the White House library. They can check them out. It was a big deal in this. It was before Netflix. Nixon comes along, and he's so worried about Johnson, who by now is driving him crazy, that he decides Johnson is calling for planes and for cars, and he wants office space, and he wants a place to work in Washington, and he wants hotel reservations, and he's driving Nixon's staff crazy. So Nixon tells a young military aide, just find him a place where he can be. Get him a place. I don't care where it is. Just find him a place. And the young military aide, whose name is Brent Scowcroft, looks across Lafayette Square, finds a house that's kind of broken down, kind of requisitions it from the GSA, and they build, over the course of the next 40 years, this very nice presidential clubhouse with 2 dining rooms, now a standing bath, and gazillion count thread sheets. The club was just redone a couple of months ago after George W. Bush was president, and this is the seal on top of the 2 beds. I took this picture when I got in. I think I was the first reporter with Bill Plant to get in. When I called Jay Carney, my old colleague at the White House, now the press secretary, asking if I could get in to the clubhouse just in time for the release of the book so we could be on CBS and show the standalone bath. He said, what house? They didn't really, not a lot of people know it's there. It's 716 Jackson Place. It's about 2,000 square feet. It used to really kind of be a dump, but they have fixed it up. This is the seal on the bed, the former president's bed. So if you are a former president and you happen to be staying overnight there and you wake up in the morning and you're not quite sure who you are, you can look down at your toes and tell. Now, I don't want to make it seem like the President's Club is all kumbaya. It's not. This is one of the more difficult moments. This is early in 1961 after the Bay of Pigs, yes. If I lose my place, just cue me. This is the moment when literally Eisenhower took Kennedy to the woodshed. Kennedy, as you know, had come into the office and he'd organized his presidency as a spokes of the wheel, and he wanted to be at the center of everything, and it didn't turn out so well. And Eisenhower takes him up. Kennedy asked Eisenhower to meet him at Camp David. This is Kennedy's first trip to Camp David. That would be Camp David, named after Dwight Eisenhower's grandson, David. And they go up there, and Ike essentially reads him the Riot Act and says, you've got to change the way you've organized your national security decision making. Kennedy says to Ike, I had no idea how tough this job was. And Ike says to him, Mr. President, with due respect, I did try to tell you 3 months ago. And yet, when they came out for pictures, and it was this picture that Kennedy wanted, because it conveyed continuity and security. This is the man who saved the world. Eisenhower says nothing but supportive stuff. Very complimentary, very positive. And when a group of Republicans go to Gettysburg a week later and say, okay, he stumbled, let's move, let's go after him, Ike says, I'm not doing it. That would have echoes later on. Some of these pictures are from the Time Life photo archive. We haven't published these. These aren't in the book. But when we were preparing the presentation, we decided to go have a special look. This is one of my favorite pictures. I believe this is at Walter Reed. But the favorite story here is on the night that Johnson is sworn in. This is from a different time, but on the night that he's sworn in, Johnson calls Ike, still at Gettysburg, and says, "I've always needed you. I need you more than ever now." And Ike gets in his car, and he drives down to Washington, and he sees Johnson in the morning, and he sits in the Oval Office, a little bit off the Oval Office, and he, on foolscap paper, gets out and writes the 15 things Johnson needs to do in the State of the Union address that night, or not State of the Union address, the joint session of Congress. He tells him what to say, and Johnson's incredibly grateful. And one of the things Ike says to Johnson is, you must put through Kennedy's economic and social programs. You must do it. So you have a Republican president telling the Democratic, suddenly the new president, that he must continue with Kennedy's program. He has no interest. Ike had no interest in Kennedy's economic program, but he knew that continuity mattered. And we see time and time again partnerships across party, in some ways that are stronger in the club than those inside of the party. A favorite moment, 35,000 feet, somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, 1981, October, on the way to Anwar Sadat's funeral in the old 707, which was noisy and cramped. This is about as much space there is in that plane for three people to get together. This is definitely on the way over because on the way back, Nixon secretly peeled off to go to Saudi Arabia. And the amazing thing that happened on this plane, I know most of you know this, is that after 4 or 5 years of unpleasant relations, this is the moment, a few hours later, when Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, two men who fought viciously in 1976, discover they have more in common than they have that separates them. And they bond over several things, over the fact that they have to build their libraries. They have to raise the money to do so. And they both don't like Ronald Reagan. The club has interesting forces internally. They also didn't like Nixon much. But on the way, when they get there, the Secret Service had arranged for the three men to arrive in Washington all within 1 minute of each other at Andrews, which must have been a fine piece of ballet by air traffic control. And they do, and they arrive in order of their seniority, but they don't know why, or they don't know that yet. And as they all get off their planes, almost simultaneously, three jet stars, they walk to the helicopter to go to the White House. They're going to briefly meet with Reagan. And all three men stop, because they aren't sure who's supposed to get on the helicopter first. The answer is Carter gets on the helicopter first because he's the most recent president, but only Nixon knew it. And he, on the way over, by the way, I just want to tip my hat to Ford here. They get on the 707 to go to Cairo. There's a refueling stop in Spain, and they're not sure what to call each other. Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, you know, a little cumbersome. And so finally Ford, with his, you know, Midwestern common sense, says, you know, for this trip, why don't we just make it Dick, Jimmy, and Jerry? This is, again, cross-party and also cross-generation. This is the buddy movie that Hollywood cannot make. I'm switching a little bit ahead of time, but when Bill Clinton becomes president, he was elected in 92, inaugurated in 1993, he has the biggest club in almost 100 years. 5 former presidents, not since Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated were there 5 former presidents. By now they're living longer. They all wanted Clinton's attention. They all wanted to help, but no one wanted his attention. Nixon was practically standing on Pennsylvania Avenue waving his arms, saying, "Call me." The stratagems Nixon employed to get Clinton's attention, I found myself writing 10 pages on just because they were so wicked. It's one of my favorite passages in the book. But eventually he gets in, and the two men actually develop this amazing friendship. And Clinton begins calling him late at night to talk about Russia and China, and to talk about how do you do this job? Literally, he asks him, how did you organize your day? When did you eat? What did you eat? When did you go to bed? How late did you stay up? And Nixon's delighted to hear this, not only because he's back in the mix and he's talking to the big guy, but because he remembers himself trying to figure it out. He remembers wanting to talk to Ike about it. And the two men become uneven but deeper friends, so that by the time Nixon dies in April 1994, about a year after this picture was taken, by then he has sent Clinton a 7-page single-spaced letter in a month before he dies that Clinton regards as one of the best documents he ever received as president. And he says, when we saw him in the fall, he said, it was just full of smart advice, and it was hard-headed, and he didn't show it to his vice president, he only showed it to Hillary. And I said, and he was quoting from it almost, and I said, how can you remember this? This is, 18 years ago. And he goes, oh, I take it out and reread it once a year. The club is complicated. Families are even more complicated. The relationship between, it's simply an amazing American story that we would have a father and a son in both their lifetimes in the presidency. There was a huge amount of speculative stuff written at the time. I think Time magazine at least resisted it, that the father was secretly advising or somehow secretly frustrated that he couldn't advise the son. I think that hugely missed the point. My own experience in covering both men is that George Herbert Walker Bush looked around at the White House of his son and could see that the son had plenty of advisors, but he only had one father. And I think that was the core of the relationship. And what made it interesting to me is that when the things got rough, and they got very difficult for both men, the son was the one who was comforting the father, not the other way around. Of course, Bush had one real son who was in the White House, and he this is one of the most interesting stories of the modern club. We could have written the whole book about this. I think the nickname, the book nicknames in the Bush family are very important. You can't underestimate their significance. And the Bush nickname for the man on that side is brother from another mother. The club is a very interesting place now, and these two men obviously teamed up, thanks to 43, on several missions. First, actually 3, I think, maybe 4. First, to raise money for the tsunami in Indonesia and Asia, then on Katrina, 2006, then on Hurricane Ike, 2008. They got to the point where they were literally finishing each other's sentences. This was a real friendship, so real that Clinton now just invites himself to Kennebunkport. I believe if you watched the funeral of Betty Ford closely, you saw that he was essentially escorting Mrs. Bush. And that relationship made it possible for Clinton to become friends with George Walker Bush. And we can talk about that relationship later. There are other difficult moments. These two men who were great friends in the 1940s and had a lot to do with organizing NATO and organizing the United Nations and organizing the way our military is structured, would come nearly to blows in the 1952 campaign. Truman would offer in 1948 Ike his job. And he said to Ike, when he still thought he might be a Democrat, he said, I'll get out of the way. You can have this job. I'll be your vice president. By the time 1952 comes around and Truman is beginning to realize that Ike is maybe a Republican, things get tricky. And they get tricky in Wisconsin, most specifically when Eisenhower goes on a campaign swing. And at this point, Joe McCarthy is attacking George Marshall, who was Ike's mentor and a huge hero to Truman. And there was a lot of pressure on Ike as a candidate to denounce McCarthy. And the key stop comes in Milwaukee when Joe McCarthy is on the stage with him, and the moment comes for Ike to say something critical of McCarthy, and he doesn't, which would have been just fine, except that the New York Times had gotten a copy of the original version of the speech, which included the remarks criticizing McCarthy that were in the end left out. This drove Truman around the bend. I knew him, I trusted him, I thought he might make a good president, but that was a mistake. In this campaign, he has betrayed almost everything I thought he stood for. Truman hits the road in 1952 and campaigns against Ike. The two men would not speak for essentially 10 years until they shared a limousine from Arlington in November of 1963 back to Blair House. And with mortality in the air, I think the two men looked at each other, and Ike, I think it was Truman who said to Ike, you want to come up for a drink? It was really the first time they had spoken since the 52 campaign. And they go upstairs and they bury the hatchet. And there's a great story from that night. Obviously, Kennedy has just been buried. Most of the people in the burial party go back to the White House where Mrs. Kennedy is throwing a reception. Ike and Truman quietly go to Blair House and have a drink, and I'm sure they had more than one. And about 9 o'clock, a knock comes on the door, and it's the military aide to the president, and he says, "I'm very sorry, but Mrs. Kennedy forgot that you were here. Would you like to come over? She feels horrible that you've been left out. Would you like to come over and join the reception?" And both men look up and say, "No, thanks. We're fine." This is one of the great profiles, double profiles. The noses alone give these men away. These are two masters of the game. This chapter is called Two Snakes in a Bottle. The New York Times called that reductive. I think it could be distilled even more. These men come literally to a very high-stakes game in the final days of the 1968 campaign. They both cheat. Johnson is desperate to end the war. He's really hurrying the negotiations with the North Vietnamese in Paris. He learns from his FBI director that Nixon is secretly counseling the South Vietnamese, "Don't take the deal, don't take the deal. I'll get you a better deal. When the Republicans are in charge, you'll do better. Don't." Johnson knows this because he's tapping the South Vietnamese, and there are other things he may be tapping, but we can set that aside for the moment. Does he confront Nixon about this with 4 days to go before the election after what the country has been through in 1968? No, he decides not to. He lets Nixon gently know through second seconds that he knows that this is going on, but he lets it slide, even though privately he says this is treason. They're contacting a foreign power in the middle of a war. Flash forward 5 years, it's January 1973. By now, Nixon is president. He's into his own problems with Watergate. The Senate is beginning the Watergate investigation. And Nixon's men call Johnson down in Texas, and they say, "You better call your friends in the Senate, or we're going to tell them, we're going to go public with what you did to us in 1968. And Johnson says, "Fine. You tell them what I did to you, and I'll tell them what you said." That's hardball by professionals. And why didn't that blow up, and why didn't that become public? Because 4 days later, Nixon is re-inaugurated for a second term, and a month later, maybe it's like a week later, Johnson dies of a heart attack. This was another difficult relationship. I think the body language is pretty clear here in 41's case. As we say at Time, that's a photo that needs no caption. Carter's a complicated case for everyone in the President's Club. He has no hesitation to tell you that he's a better ex-president than he was president. He also won't hesitate to tell you that, as he says here, "I feel that my role as a former president is probably superior to that of the other presidents." Yet all the former presidents use him. They all send him on secret missions, except for Reagan. They all put him to work. He's able to open doors and go places and meet people and cut Gordian knots that presidents, for whatever reason, can't do. And Bush puts him to work several times. Clinton puts him to work several times. George Walker Bush did it, and so has Barack Obama. He is the most important presidential fact of the year. On September the 12th, I think, Jimmy Carter becomes the longest living former president in history. 31 years, 8 months, 24 days, beating Herbert Hoover's record. That's a long time for a second act, and he's done a pretty remarkable job, but he can be a handful. I'm speaking at the Carter Library next week. I'm not sure how I'm going to... But he invited, this is another picture that tells you a story. Good eye contact there, don't you think? These two men were obviously had their hands full in 2008 when Clinton's wife ran against Obama. Bill became the issue in that race, very much so. Obama wrote in his book, I think the audacity of hope that Clinton was ill-suited as a transformational Democrat. Clinton called Obama's campaign a fairy tale. They are rivals for, this is why sometimes presidents in the same party don't get along. They're rivals for history's favor. Which one of them is going to emerge at the end of the day as the president who was able to advance progressive policies in essentially a center-right era? That's the question. We don't know the answer yet. They have gone from sort of ice cold in 2008, 2009. They've warmed up now. Clinton is the star of the 17-minute Obama re-election video. You could easily think, watching that video, that it was Clinton who was running. There are lots of examples of presidents working together that we never hear about. These two men really did reorganize the federal government in 1948 and made the presidency what it is today. They're the ones who created the new National Security Organization, who created, the Defense Department as we know it. They came together for the country's best interests. They did it across party. This is one of my favorite pictures in the click-through. It's taken in Palm Beach, 1960. It's a picture Kennedy helped organize. It's 4 days after the 1960 election, which a lot of people thought Nixon should contest. He decides not to contest it, but he only decides it after he gets a call first from Herbert Hoover saying, you ought to go see Kennedy and bury the hatchet. Nixon then calls Ike and says, Hoover just called me. He says, I got to go see Jack, who he was old friends with. Ike says, yeah, there are more important things now. The country, I think the quote, well, this is a Hoover quote, I think we're in enough trouble in the world today, Hoover told Nixon, some indications of national unity are not only desirable but essential. So essentially Nixon just said, okay, I'll go, and they meet, and they have this picture, again, for national unity. I also think to preserve the power of the presidency, which I think was very much an issue between Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon. Nixon had nearly destroyed the presidency. Ford understood in ways few of us can that in a government that isn't functioning, the presidency must function. And so he moved quickly in his presidency to make sure that it did. This is one of my favorite pictures. Now there's a backstory. I'm sorry about the attribution at the bottom. The great story here that's in the book is in 1998, when Bill Clinton gets in his own impeachment trouble, there's an active and little-known campaign by Gerald Ford and later Jimmy Carter to somehow avoid a Senate trial. Certainly first to avoid an impeachment and then a Senate trial. Ford works both in public, through the New York Times op-ed page, and then later in private. First with the White House counsel, later with Clinton himself, to try to get him to stop short, to cut some kind of a deal. And I think Ford had three things in mind. One was simply, don't put the country through this again, please. Two, I think he was concerned about his own party, which was fully capable of running completely off the rails. And I think he was concerned most of all with the presidency itself. It can't take endless shots. This is a picture from about a year later when President Clinton could not, by the way, at the climactic conversation, Ford's nearly got Clinton to agree to maybe say something contrite, but he wants a complete admission that Clinton had lied, and Clinton can't do it, and they're literally on the phone saying, I think you have to say this, and if you say this, maybe we can get somewhere. And Clinton couldn't do it because by then Clinton decided he probably wanted to fight this, that it was in his advantage. A couple more and then we're done. This is a picture most people don't even know exists. Most people don't even know these two men met. This is in, it's a little out of order in this picture because this would have been a couple years earlier, but this is in Century City, LA, a few weeks after Clinton was elected. He's paying a courtesy call on Reagan. Reagan is not yet in the full throes of Alzheimer's, but it's the last time we ever saw these two men together. In fact, I don't think they met after this. But Clinton asks Reagan, do you have any advice for me? And Reagan says, yeah, go to Camp David. And some of you may have heard me do this story before, but he says, and I've watched you on the campaign, and I got to tell you, you just have the wimpiest salute I have ever seen. And Clinton, who'd never served in the service, or played someone who'd served in the service, Reagan did both. says, well, like what? And Reagan says, well, you got to bring it up slow, like it's covered with honey, and then shake it off fast, like it's covered with something else. And so they actually stand up and practice saluting in Reagan's office. And Clinton would later practice with his own guys, although he had some trouble finding anyone on the Clinton White House staff who'd actually been in the service either. I'm not making that up. This is the last picture we have of the club together. January 2009, President-elect Obama asked George W. Bush to get the band back together. Bush says, Carter too? Yeah, Carter too. And they sit around and have lunch off the Oval Office, and they don't talk about Congress or the Middle East or foreign policy or how to get past the law. They talk about how hard it is to just have a normal life in this job, about their kids and their spouses and their families. And it's kind of a normal conversation that any of us could have been a part of, except that none of us could have understood it. And as we think about the club, two things kind of emerge. One is the sentiment of Bush here, which is after they've done it, they all say something like this. Just as Ike said to Kennedy, I'm with you after the Bay of Pigs, Bush says to Obama, we want you to succeed. All of us who have served in this office understand that the office transcends the individual, all of us. We asked once W what he thought of, if he thought differently of Clinton now that he'd had the job, and he said, I think differently of all of them. They all come out with scars. Even when they're successful, they come out with welts. Even when they win 2 terms, they come out with wish I could have done it differently. They all come out with regrets, and they all have to live with them forever. And unlike us, our regrets are big, and we all have them. Theirs are bigger. And so that experience, that fundamental sort of human thing, is what really binds these men together. Not their electoral college vote counts. It's the fact that they have survived it and they have, regrets about it, and so they are able across ages and across parties, and across everything here. Look at this group. It's truly an American picture. Are able to come together to do stuff, and it's a lesson, I think, for the rest of us. So I will stop there, and I'd be glad to take your questions. That is really the best thing any Columbus boy has ever received.
It strikes me that the club is going to be much younger in future years, even if Obama wins a second term. And I'm just curious if you think that will change the dynamics of the interaction, the dynamics of the club with that lower age level.
The club now is a really interesting place. Think about it. There are 2 men who were born in 1924, Carter and Bush 1. 6 months apart, both turn 88 this year. There are 2 men who were born in 1946, Clinton and Bush 2, both turned 66 this year. Those 2 men are the most closely born presidents in American history. 6 weeks. Nobody's close. Interesting, too, because they're the bipolar opposites of the baby boom generation. It shows you about how it's amazing. And yet they have come together largely because of, they're all in one family now, and to do stuff. Clinton and Bush too. In fact, they're business partners. You know this, right? Right, yeah. Well, the book is really good. And did I mention Father's Day is coming up? Yeah, well, they're business partners. They probably don't list it on their Schedule Cs, but they both, a couple times a year, go out to various places and sit in 2 armchairs on a stage, much like this, and talk about what it's like to be president, and walk home with, 6-figure checks, bigger than I can imagine. Slightly bigger than what I'm getting tonight. And it's an amazing, that's a new thing for the club. They're actually kind of, and they're both good at it. And if I were going to do a sequel, the 2 men I would watch are those 2. But you're right, whether President Obama wins or loses in November, he will be one of the youngest club members ever. And so the club is I think, going to have a busy period, and I think it will look different. And I think these men are will carry on the traditions that have been, sort of outlined here today. I think they all think in these terms. So I'm optimistic. Yes, sir.
I have a question actually about Washington Week, the TV show. I'm just curious about how the panel is put together, who has the power, so to speak, to assemble the different media types, and whether there's kind of some posturing between folks in the media to be on that show, and what you think it does for you as far as your visibility is concerned.
I'm going to channel Gwen here because I know her really well. If Gwen were here tonight, she would say, "I decide."
I figured
And
that.
there would be no follow-up to that question. I hope she's watching. Yes, sir.
I've enjoyed your anecdotes and the background to the meetings among the presidents. I'd like to ask if the presidents could be called secret or back channel communications were influential in deciding the fate of the nation and maybe the world at critical times, such as the Kennedy, the October Kennedy missile crisis, and times involving war in the when was it, in the 1980s between Egypt and Israel, just to name two. And also, if you'd comment on the influence of the former presidents in the current presidential election campaign. Thank you.
The question is, was the club influential in kind of world historical terms? I don't think any two men in the club did as much for the world as Truman and Hoover did. That feeding program in 1946, 1947 was truly, they saved millions of lives and really set a standard for the club that's tough to match. That's a high hurdle in terms of achievement. But it was a great role model. I think in crises, particularly foreign policy crises, all these men have reached out to their predecessors. Johnson brought Ike into the White House at every chance he could. He created excuses for him to come to Washington. He let him run national security meetings. Imagine that today. He let Ike run national security meetings because he trusted him so much. Bush turns to Nixon when he's trying to figure out what to do with Tiananmen Square. The examples are, there's one, it got a little, we have more of those than we need. And so there's lots of that throughout the book, particularly on foreign policy. So I feel like that is a place where the club is functioning well and continues to function pretty well, and I'm kind of relieved about that.
Is there any standout event, though, that you have information heretofore not made public on, in which the involvement of presidents in secret communications was critical to the to war and peace?
Everything I know is in the book, and if it's not, Nancy might have my head. So no, I left it all on the field.
Thank you.
You bet. Yes.
I think everybody here is just thrilled that you have come to the Ford, so thank you.
Yeah.
And we're all probably looking forward to another book, and we want you to come back to Ann Arbor. My question is, there's a great piece in the New York Times today about the power of executive orders. And it talks about Lincoln pushing the people and the states and Congress before they're really ready to make pronouncements. Talks about Truman with the desegregation of the Army. Do you think that Obama's latest statement, which is not an executive order, but a powerful statement from the presidency, had any support from the club, and whether or not you think anything else is going to happen to it? Will it start a movement in this
About
country?
same-sex marriage, is that what you're talking about?
Yes. About
I have
your-
no indication that the club was, well, I certainly don't think it was involved. And if you're talking about a movement inside the club, no. I don't. As about a larger political movement, I'm disinclined to predict. Yes, go ahead.
Question is, initially the presidents of different parties are quite polarized in their belief systems. After they become presidents and they're retired, do you see a convergence of these presidents from different parties to be more central, more moderate on both sides?
Well, I think that opening quote by Clinton, which my machine has gone dead here, where he says, it's at the end of the day, we just wanted something good to happen. I think when Bush 41 and Clinton started hitting the road, and they did it a lot in 2006, 2007, they raised something like $150 million because people just wanted to give to them. They hadn't seen this kind of bipartisan, thing in so long that it was like, oh yeah, that's what we're about. Oh yeah, well, everyone gave them money. It was astonishing. I think we're so starved for that I think the club has kind of seen that as an opportunity. Were they all partisan as presidents? Yeah, they all were. Did they all come away thinking, that the secret to long-term success is not being that way? I think they all do. I think if you read their memoirs, you can see it. I think if you read their letters, you can see it. Is it enough to change our politics? No, not yet.
One more quick question. Why did you start with Truman and Hoover and not with Jefferson and Adams when they had that wonderful friendship?
It's a better question than any answer I could give. Yes, go ahead.
How does the club change when a woman joins?
Well, if it can overcome like that picture of Nixon and Clinton, or the differences are so vast among these men, and
the picture of America becomes more complete.
Right. I was going to actually say, this week someone wrote a column this week about the new French president. Sarkozy loses, Hollande comes in, and someone wrote a really nice column in the Times on Sunday about how, this is a more French president. He's tall, he's grandfatherly, he's patrician, he's elitist, he's anti-American. He's just what the French want. And Sarkozy was none of those things. He was pro-American, he was kind of working class, and he was kind of down in the street. And I was thinking how different that was, because it seems to me in a lot of other countries, the leaders they elect were all from the same club before they got elected. And that picture, which is gone now because my battery died, is a quintessentially American thing. Who would have put those five guys, much less Reagan and Lyndon Johnson, in any club? You couldn't have invented it. Hollywood would have laughed you off the lot. But we make that club, and we choose it, and to me that's a reflection of us. I mean, we're kind of all like that. So, and so I don't think it will have any trouble bridging a gender if it can bridge ideology.
The wives of these people, do they ever get along? Especially afterwards? They don't like seeing and hearing the things that are said about their husbands.
Well, we didn't look at the first ladies. It was complicated enough to do the men. And everyone asked this question, is there a club like it? And the closest thing I have to a satisfying answer, and it's not very satisfying, is something I think Linda Bird Johnson told me when we were doing the Billy Graham book. And she said, there's a reason we all the families like each other. And it's not because we're really good people. It's just that we know it's this version of the same thing. We know what it's like. We know how hard it is. We know what it does to you and what it does to your husband. And I suspect, I was in the Reagan Library last week or 2 weeks ago, and Nancy's office is still there, and she's got a picture of all the first ladies, I think going back to Mrs. Kennedy, 7 or 8. And it's a lovely picture because you look at the faces and you see that they all have had that shared experience. But we didn't look at it in any detail. So I can't really tell you beyond that. But I think it makes sense that there would be some kind of affinity along those lines.
Thank you.
You bet.
You said you wrote half the book, and we're all curious which half that is and whether we will know or...
I wrote the second half. Nancy wrote the first half. Nancy's an amazing historian, and she did from Hoover all the way through to the Nixon-Johnson, and then I took from Nixon forward on to now. Partly because I'd covered most of those guys, and because I don't know what I would have done if I couldn't have talked to people who were alive. And that's really, she's an amazing she's amazing, and she's really good at taking things from lots of different sources. So that's how it splits. And then what we do is we would send chapters back and forth, and we'd tear them up and rewrite them, and then we'd send them back and forth again, and we'd tear them up and rewrite them, and then we read it out loud several times to make sure that it was worth listening to. And that's how we do our stories. So, yes, sir.
Can we assume that you talked to each of the living presidents?
No. We talked to President Bush one, who's best by email because he communicates really well in that. We sent questions and he sent back wonderful answers. We talked to Bill Clinton, who was great. We talked to Jimmy Carter, who was great. We ran some things by George W. Bush. We didn't talk to him, but we got some guidance. And we did not talk to President Obama.
Amongst the presidents that you did talk to, were there differences in their levels of cooperation and candidness with you?
Not that bothered me or surprised me. There are always differences, but they could have all said no. That would be the biggest difference in cooperation. And so they all talked to us. And I don't really want to go into that. But if you haven't, no, I'm sorry.
Were you able to form an opinion as to the relationship with the former presidents and Carter?
Yes.
Will you elaborate?
I came away from this book feeling with a higher opinion of virtually all of them. I really did. Nixon's a handful for me, but even Carter, as complicated as he can be, is an astonishing former president. I mean, he's redefined the genre. And I'd say, he will hit this milestone this year. But he's a handful for anyone who follows him as president. I asked him, in 1990, he does this astonishing thing where he basically mounts a campaign against George Herbert Walker Bush's plans to liberate Kuwait by sending a series of letters to members of the UN Security Council asking them to get out of Bush's coalition. This is borderline treason under the Logan Act. At least that's what the Bush people thought. And they quietly told him to cease and desist, but he didn't. He wrote a second series of letters to a second group, the Arab League, and urged them to do the same thing. And I asked him about it this year. This is why Carter's so great. He's happy to take your questions. And he says, no, I would have done the same thing all over again because and his answer wasn't terribly convincing, but he didn't back away. So he's a handful, but he also got Bush and Clinton and to some extent Obama out of some tricky spots and didn't always get the credit for what he deserved. So it's a mixed bag, but I generally came away thinking better of all of them, which is another reason I'm glad I did it. I think it's surprised me that way.
Many of us here over the years have heard different speakers from Bob Woodward to Benton Becker talk in detail about President Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon and all of the details of how that was worked out and President Ford's insistence on keeping the presidential papers and Nixon's acknowledgement of guilt and so on. But nobody's talked really about the impact on the Gerald Ford-Richard Nixon relationship and how it flowed from that. If you could say a couple of words about that, given that we are here in the Gerald Ford Presidential Library, I'd be grateful.
I was surprised by a couple of things. I didn't know that the first man Ford meets when he is sworn in as a member of the House, man comes up to him on the well of the House in 1949. It's Richard Nixon, who says, "I heard about your race in Michigan. I wanted to say hello." It's the first person he meets as a congressman. They became friends. They carpooled together. You can hear in Ford's memoirs him becoming more and more uncertain about Nixon as he goes on. You can see in the record that Nixon dangles the vice presidency twice at Ford. First in 1960. It's not sure it's a serious dangle, but there's something of a dangle. And then in 1968, he does it again in Miami Beach. It's a serious enough dangle that President Ford, not President Ford by then, Jerry Ford and Betty stay up the night waiting to hear in 60. That's in Betty's memoirs. So there was enough of a dangle. So this is someone who supported President Nixon in critical moments in the 1950s. By the 1960s and 70s, he's seeing him a little differently. To me, the story of the pardon is about the presidency. It's what we see time and again in the club, which is that the power of the men who have this office to protect its vitality and its clout is almost at every point paramount. And it's not something they can really talk about. It's not something any of us understand in the moment or the heat of the politics. But to me, that is the key to understanding what he did. And it's the key to understanding why he came back at Clinton so hard 25 years later. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. I think one of the things that has, surprisingly to me, lifted my spirits in hearing you speak is the humanity piece with all of these men, and that you came away thinking higher of all of them. I was also impressed with whether they were Republican or Democrat, that they put after the fact, after they were president, the presidency first and the country as a whole, and that things can't get bogged down. And do you see any way that that could be used, or that modern politicians, and I'm just so frustrated with the whole process, as we all are, that somehow it can trickle down to, that's not my party, but yes, but I will use that term, to try to get the presidential candidates back on track, and also the media. I mean, I love the media. I love watching you and Gwen, but just the difficult situation that we're in now, that they can't even be themselves. I mean, maybe they never have been because they have to get elected. But
I know what you mean.
Yes,
I'm not sure how to answer your question other than to say that this was our contribution. We don't have a follow-up act planned, but at some point early in the writing of the book, we realized this was going to apply to today, because we were seeing things that we haven't seen in a while.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. I think they're crying uncle. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.